Can you guys hear me okay? Excellent. Thank you so much for coming out. I realize it's sort of a big sell. You know, Friday night, come to campus. It was looking a little deserted as I walked in earlier, and I was like, oh, I don't know about this. Before I start, I just wanted to mention, I'm going to be talking about two kinds of primates in this story. I'm going to be talking about some of the human backstory. We are primates, but I'm also going to be talking about the fossil primates of the West Texas Eocene. So, hope you enjoy. Now, before we go any further, oh right, I have this thing. I want to acknowledge something about the sort of science that I do. When most people think science, they think something like this. They think lab coat and gloves and expensive instrumentation, pipetting, controlled experimentation. As great as that is, as many wonderful things as you can learn with a controlled experiment, let me just say that in some fields of science, it's a little bit more like this. Most people don't think of science as having anything to do with going to Vegas and hitting, the craps tables. But it is true that some kinds of science are like that, and I say, welcome to the wonderful world of paleontology. Because no matter how prepared you are, no matter how ambitious you may be, no matter how badly you want to find that amazing fossil, you might, but more likely you won't. In fact, every time you go out into the field, this is my bald head, there's my grad student Addie who's seated in the back, climbing up the slope, and we've been wandering around for a couple of days and we haven't found anything. So, the payoffs in paleontology can be huge, but every time you go collect fossils in the field, you're much more likely to be skunked. And this is a little bit of paleo jargon that I might as well explain to you. Skunked. This is when you go out looking for fossils, you look for a day, a week, months sometimes, and you don't find anything interesting. And this happens to every paleontologist. These are the stories that you don't hear about. And you guys can probably imagine why it's called getting skunked, right? Because it stinks to not find fossils. So here's what you need to find fossils. There's no escaping the fact that you have to have some measure of good luck, number one. Of course, it helps to have some training. It helps to be persistent. It helps maybe even more to have some money. But as in other fields of science, you need giant shoulders to stand on. And I have a picture of John Andrew Wilson here because these are the giant shoulders that I stand on in my paleontological fieldwork. So he was born in a small town in Massachusetts. He got his PhD in geosciences from the University of Michigan. And he did his first fieldwork in the late 20s and the 30s, mostly in North America, places like New Mexico and Montana. And it was in the 1940s that he came to the University of Texas as a young geology professor. And he, among other things, he founded UT's Vertebrate Paleontology Lab. This is the most important paleontological repository of record in the state of Texas. This is where all of my fossils that I find in my fieldwork are curated. But the real story I want to tell you about Jack Wilson, as he was known to his friends and family, starts in Big Bend National Park. So if you've ever been to Big Bend and you've coming south from Fort Stockton, you go through Persimmon Gap and you're headed towards Panther Junction. How many of you have been to Big Bend before? Yes, okay, a lot of people. As you're headed into Panther Junction, you cross the Tornillo Flat and you see a sign that says Fossil Bone Exhibit ahead. And if you pull off, what you used to see is a little teeny covered area with some casts of fossils that were found by Jack Wilson, a parking area. Now I'm told that there is an amazing new fossil display there that's just opened up in the last couple of weeks. But how many of you have been to the Fossil Bone Exhibit before? Fewer of you, okay. Well, this is out there, and the story goes like this. It was the early 50s, and there was a geological field trip coming from UT, headed out into Big Bend to look at the geology, and at the time, Big Bend National Park was known as a great place to look for dinosaurs and giant crocodiles from the Cretaceous and things like that. It was not known particularly as a place to look for fossil mammals. And what they would do in these field trips, which they still do to the present day, is the bus would pull over by the side of the road, ladies would go to one side, gents would go to the other side, and they would answer nature's call. And so according to the story that is well known at the Vertebrate Paleontology Lab, Jack Wilson wandered off on his side of the road to go to the bathroom, and he looked down and he saw something incredible. He saw the skull of a fossil mammal called Coryphodon. So here are some artists' representations of Coryphodon. Here's a skull of Coryphodon. I was just peeking at this specimen this morning out of the Vertebrate Paleontology Lab. Now this is an extinct genus of mammal from the Eocene epoch. And the Eocene, it's a very long period of time, more than 20 million years, and it spans the time period between about 56 and 34 million years ago. And just to put it in context for you, this is after non-avian dinosaurs go extinct. But as modern mammals are starting to come on the scene, the groups of mammals that you would recognize today, the groups like perissodactyls that include horses and rhinos, the groups that include called Artiodactyla that include things like deer and cows, and primates, they're coming onto the scene in the fossil record during the Eocene. So this set Jack Wilson down the path of more than 30 years of productive paleontological fieldwork in the Eocene of the Big Bend region. So he and his students for decades worked in Big Bend National Park. They eventually realized that there were other great fossils. And let me just say this. It does not take a trained paleontologist to see that some parts of Big Bend National Park are absolutely littered with fossils. It's incredible to me that you can, in a well-traveled national park, park your car by the side of the road, go wandering about 20 yards off to the side of the road, and you're like, wow, look, there's a fossil turtle right here. Some places are absolutely chock full of fossils, and I just grabbed almost at random this picture from my files of a nice eroding badland surface with a big log coming out of it. So there were lots more fossils to find in the Eocene of Big Bend National Park, but in the 1960s, they expanded their area of study to a place about 60 miles northwest of Big Bend National Park called the Sierra Vieja. This is north of the Chinati Mountains and Chinati Hot Springs, if you guys have ever been out there. If you've been there, you've maybe been to Capote Falls. And then, in the 1970s, actually early in 1970, Wilson and his students moved into an area called the Devil's Graveyard, which sounds ominous, but you can see the Devil's Graveyard is this stunning badland landscape that's just north of Big Bend Ranch State Park. And on a map, here's where they fall. Here we are right now in Austin. Here's the Big Bend of the Rio Grande that gives the region its name. Here's the national park, the Devil's Graveyard. Big Bend Ranch State Park is right here. These are the Davis Mountains. Here's the Sierra Vieja. And if you're wondering why there are so many great Eocene-aged fossils in this part of Texas, the answer is, of course, geology. Hooray for geology. As you just heard, I'm a native Texan. I grew up in Austin, and I'm going to share with you an interesting factoid that you can amaze and maybe annoy your friends with at cocktail parties, something that I had no idea about when I was growing up here in Austin, and that is that the Rocky Mountains pass through Texas. Did you guys know this? Yeah, everybody's nodding. I guess I was the only uninformed kid growing up in Austin. So as you're traveling down I-10, you'll see some big mountains like the Davis Mountains and a few other areas. Those are volcanics, as you'll see in a second. But some of these mountains, like the Del Norte, coming down into the Santiago and the Del Carmen, and the Apache Mountains up here, going all the way up into New Mexico, this is the front range of the Rocky Mountains as it passes through Texas. And as you cross the Rio Grande, the mountain range just changes its name to the Sierra Madre. It's still the Rockies. So in other words, you could follow this front range all the way up through New Mexico, Colorado. You could actually end up in Alberta, right? British Columbia. So this is essentially as far as the Rocky Mountains got, when they were rising during the period about 70 to 40 million years ago. And what's really cool about mountain building episodes is you've got crust and it's deforming and it's building high mountain ranges, but people tend to focus on the mountains. They tend to focus less on the space between them, right? It's like that old Zen koan. It's not the basket that's important, it's the space within. Anyway, so what you have on the other side of the Rocky Mountain front is something called the Tornillo Basin. And this is a topographic low that was between two mountain ranges, right? As these mountains rose, there were spaces between them. And what's great is you think about these basins as traps for sediment. And it's sedimentary rocks where you find fossils. So you have all of the rivers and streams draining internally into the Tornillo Basin for a while. And as those sediments pile up between the mountain ranges, they're preserving an amazing record of Eocene fossils. And there's another part of the story as well, and that is the fact that the Big Bend is absolutely filled with ancient volcanoes. This period of Rocky Mountain building, towards the end, what you see is a whole bunch of volcanoes popping up. So if you've been to the McDonald Observatory up in the Davis Mountains, you probably knew that you were standing on an ancient volcano. The Chizos Mountains in Big Bend National Park, volcanoes, Christmas Mountains, Chinati Mountains, and so on. So essentially, all over this basin, you've got volcanoes. And the volcanoes really start in the Middle Eocene. And here's the great thing about volcanoes. Some of you more savvy, geology-informed people are no doubt thinking, I don't think that hot lava is a great way to preserve fossils. And you're right. But if there's one thing that volcanoes are really good at doing, it's burying stuff. Volcanoes produce tons upon tons upon tons of sediment. And this sediment, right, it's erupted out as ash and rock fragments and things like that. Here's an eruption happening. And all of this sediment, mainly ash, is going to be redistributed by rivers. It has to go somewhere. And when you have a great big slurry of this stuff coming down a river valley, it's called a lahar. So here's some poor house, I think in Chile, that got buried by a lahar. But you have this great combination of a sedimentary basin that wants to trap sediment and a source of volcanoes in the Eocene that are providing the sediment, and it's that material that all of the fossils are preserved in. So it's volcanic material, but it's been redistributed by rivers. So don't think volcanic eruption, some animals coming along running from the lava and then, it's frozen in place or something like that. That's not how it works. So here's another really interesting part of the story. You guys already know this from the title of the talk. And that is that when these volcanoes were active, the Big Bend was a very different place than it is today. So here is an iconic view of the Big Bend. So, and I apologize to you guys who have to look through my head. I should duck walk across the stage for you. Here's the Rio Grande. There are the Santa Elena Mountains off in the distance at sunset. And what you see in the foreground is a typical Chihuahuan desert landscape, right? Some low ground cover, no trees to speak of. But if you were going to step into a time machine and magically transport yourself back to 45 million years ago in the Eocene, you would see a view more like this. So this is a view of the Arenal volcano in Costa Rica. So what I'm going to ask you to do through this talk is I'm going to ask you in your imagination to build up a picture. If you think in pictures, build up a picture. If you think in feelings, build up a feeling. Build up some sort of a mental representation of what the Big Bend was like in the Eocene. And the first thing I want you to start with are tall, active volcanic peaks that are periodically erupting and belching out sediment. But then the real reason I chose this picture, I could have chosen an active volcano from Antarctica, right? But what I really want you to notice are the humid tropical forests that are cloaking the slopes of these volcanoes. That's the sort of habitat that you would have had in the Big Bend 45 million years ago. And if you're wondering how you can have tropical forests in West Texas, let me just warn you, we're about to geek out for a second, science-like. I have to show you a chart. And let me just pop down for a second and tell you what you're looking at. So what I want you to notice is this is temperature on this axis. So the more you move up on this chart, the hotter it is. The more you move down in this chart, the cooler it is. And what you're looking at is a plot of the average surface temperature of the Earth over the last 66 million years. So here is 66 million years ago when all of the non-bird dinosaurs get whacked by a giant asteroid hitting the Yucatan Peninsula. And you move forward through the millions of years up to the present day. And for those of you who are wondering what makes up these data points, these are data points from deep sea ocean cores that look at the ratio of stable isotopes of oxygen that is a reliable indicator of ancient climate. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but if anybody's curious about how that works, ask me afterwards. But what I want you to notice is, right, you get a whole bunch of cores, samples that you've drilled up, and you get this curve, a very high fidelity curve of ancient climate since the dinosaurs mostly went extinct. And the main thing I want you guys to notice about the Eocene, which is this pink area in here, if this is the present day, I want you to notice that the temperature varies over the Eocene, but the entirety of the Eocene is much, much warmer than the present day. Now that doesn't mean, as I like to tell my undergraduates, it doesn't mean it was so hot at the equator that you could melt lead there. It means that the average surface temperature of the Earth is higher because the zone of warm tropical conditions extends further out from the equator towards the poles. And so what you had in North America during the Eocene, when it was so much warmer than it is today, is widespread tropical forests, including West Texas. And when I say widespread, I mean all the way up to Alaska. I mean all the way up into Canada. For example, here's a view of Ellesmere Island in the Canadian high Arctic today. This is a typical glacial landscape. There's almost nothing growing on the ground because it's frozen for most of the year. It's all permafrost, just a couple of inches down. If you went back to Ellesmere Island 55 million years ago, this is what you would see. You would see subtropical, humid forests with all of the cool animals that lived there. So in fact, here's your friend Coricidin, again, that we've already seen from Big Bend National Park. So, let me just say that if you know what you're looking for, as you hike around Big Bend National Park and other parts of the Big Bend region, you see evidence of these ancient tropical forests all over the place. This is my foot, in fact, for scale, and my hammer. But what you're looking at is an Eocene sandstone with an impression in it. Can you guys tell what that is? Anybody want to guess? A palm. Yes, somebody said palm. This is a impression. And if there's one thing you can generalize about palms is they don't like freezing temperatures. So if you start seeing evidence of palms, start thinking, oh, but it probably didn't freeze in the winter. This is maybe an even more telling indicator of ancient environment. This is from one of my fossil sites in the Devil's Graveyard. And there are places where these are just littering the ground. They're land snails. I know you guys came here. I was promising primates, not land snails, gastropods, but bear with me. This is a living genus of gastropod. And these gastropods, it's called Lycino. They are only found in humid lowland tropical forests of Central America today. So they don't like to live outside the tropics. And this is what was crawling around these forests in the Big Bend. And if you go to the Tornillo Flat and you hike around, which is one of my favorite things to do, so you're hiking through the Badlands, you will notice sticking up out of the Badlands these sort of orange and red columns right out of the ground. And I'll confess to you, the first time I saw these, I had no idea what they were until I walked up and I started kicking around and looking at the bits. And it finally occurred to me, wait a second, this is a fossil tree stump. In fact, in some parts of the desert on the Tornillo Flat, you come up over a rise, and what you see is not one stump, but many stumps. So here, these are not just rocks. These are tree stumps sticking up out of the sediment. And so it doesn't take too much imagination to realize you're walking through an ancient forest, and you're surrounded by the stumps of these tropical trees. Then that explains why when you go to most of the sandstones, you find that they're full of lignite, carbonized wood, because you were in a forest. And the real kicker is what makes these beautiful banded colors in the Badlands in the first place. These are called paleosols, or ancient soil horizons. And just for scale, I'm up on top of one of these whalebacks. Here are two grad students for scale. And what I want to do is I want you to focus on each color change as you move up the side of this hill. Each one is a new soil horizon. And so what happens is somewhere off in the distance, a volcano has erupted, deposited a bunch of sediment, and ultimately a river that's draining that area goes into flood. It picks up a bunch of that sediment, it overruns its natural levees, it dumps that sediment on a floodplain, and it buries most of the plants that are there, and who knows how many feet of ash that's been redistributed by rivers. But over the next few decades, a forest community grows up on that ash and turns it into a soil. And if you know what you're looking for, the characteristics of these bands, each one is a new soil horizon. Here, here, here. And this process happens over and over and over again. It repeats itself. So Megan Emery, who just got her PhD at the University of Oregon, just gave a talk on this at the Geological Society of America a couple of weeks ago. Guess what? Every single one of these soil horizons is from a tropical forest. What a surprise. They're tropical forest soils. So basically, all signs point in the same direction. And this is interesting because as somebody who's interested in the paleontological record of the Big Bend, I'm really curious about who lived in these forests, right? Who are the inhabitants of these tropical forests? And if you're wondering, wait a second, what does an anthropologist have to do with any of this anyway? Well, I'll come to that in a second. But what I want to do is I want to take you on a tour of some of the animals that have been found out in the Big Bend in these ancient forests. So this is a lower jaw with all of the teeth in place, well, most of the teeth in place. Here's a close-up of the teeth. This is a little teeny forest-dwelling horse called Epihippus from the Eocene. Epihippus, here's a full skeleton of Epihippus. Epihippus, in my mind, is notable for two things. Number one, you guys know how many toes horses and zebras and things like that have today? Yes. One. That is exactly right. I'm not being rude to anybody. I'm just going to show you how horses run around. Horses run around on their middle fingers and their middle toes, and they're very large, and they've lost their other toes. If you look here at the forefoot and the hindfoot of Epihippus, you can see the middle toe is the biggest, but most of those toes have not been lost yet. So that's one cool thing. So is everybody building up some sort of a mental idea of these tropical forests? Tall volcanic peaks, lush rainforest, dripping, humid, closed canopy, green, jungle, right? And now what I want you to do is I want you to take a horse with multiple toes and shove it down on the ground, somewhere in the undergrowth, nibbling away at the vegetation. And when I say small, I mean really small. I mean about the size and build of a miniature Doberman. That's right. A little horse with multiple toes, about yay big, clippy-clopping around, yes, the forest floor, nibbling at things. I imagine they were very cute. All right. At the other end of the herbivore size spectrum are these great slathering beasts called brontotheres, which one of my grad students is always reminding me means thunder beasts. But to do it right, I have to say thunder beast. Brontothere. This is the same watch that I'm wearing right here for scale. This is a skull that was actually collected by Wilson in the 1970s. These are its upper teeth, the bottom of its brain case. Here's a whole skull of a brontothere. This one's called Protitanotherium. The later brontotheres are cool. They are related to rhinos, but they are their own group that's gone extinct since then. But unlike rhinos, they don't get horns on the tip of their nose. They get this crazy-looking sort of paddle or spoon-like thing that sticks up. So that's pretty cool. So this is the biggest herbivore down on the forest floor. And where you have lots of meat on the hoof, you've got carnivores that will be preying upon those herbivores. And what you're looking at from the later Eocene in the Devil's Graveyard, this is an upper jaw with a bunch of teeth. And it doesn't take too much imagination to see that these teeth are the sort of teeth that would be great for chopping up great bites of meat and things like that. But what's really interesting about these teeth is that these are not just the teeth of a carnivorous mammal. And by the way, this is something called Harpagolestes that is not related to living carnivores. It's a different group called the mesonychids that people used to think were closely related to whales. The reason I'm showing you Harpagolestes is because I want you to see that this is a whole community of mammals that we sample out in the Big Bend. And this is the biggest and the baddest of the carnivores. So if you're wondering who ate Protitanotherium, probably something like Harpagolestes. And what's really cool about these teeth is how blunt they are. These are teeth that look to me, for all the world, in terms of their mechanics, like the teeth of a spotted hyena. And what's really cool about spotted hyenas is they don't just eat the soft bits of the animal that they've killed. The fleshy bits are what they eat first. But when a really hungry group of spotted hyena go in on a gazelle or something like that, they'll eat the meat first, then they'll eat the skin, then they'll crunch the bones. And they'll eat the bones, chew them up into fragments. They won't just eat the marrow. They will actually eat all of the bone fragments. That's what these teeth are adapted for, a bone crusher, like a spotted hyena or a wolverine. And by the way, if the hyenas are still hungry, when they're done with the bones, they start in on the hooves and the antlers. Or the, I guess horns, I said, right? I said antelope. So when a hungry group of spotted hyenas is done with a kill, there's nothing but a bloody smear left on the ground. Harpagolestes, there you go. You wouldn't want to meet one. There were, in fact, I said that things like brontotheres are closely related to rhinos. One of the most common large mammals that we find out in the Big Bend is an actual proper rhino, related to rhinos that you find today. You can see from my watch, again, this is a little bit smaller, but it's still a big animal. This is a skull, an inferior view, and a side view. There's the tip of the snout and the eye socket, and there's the brain case. Imagine something not really big like a black rhino. Imagine like a Sumatran rhino, one of these smaller rainforest rhinos. But don't think of something that acts like a rhino. In terms of ecology or lifestyle, think of something more like a hippopotamus. So, I hope your mental picture now has little teeny multi-toed forest horses, great big brontotheres and the predators that ate them. And now, in the streams, I want you to put some small semi-aquatic rhinoceroses, which leads me, I will digress. I apologize, but I can't give this talk without showing you guys the coolest thing that I have ever seen while hiking in West Texas. Are you ready? This is a canyon in the Devil's Graveyard. And if you hike down this canyon, you see these boulders that have fallen down into the creek bed? You eventually come to this 38-million-year-old sandstone boulder. And this sandstone boulder, as you guys can see, right? Here's the edge of the cliff. Here's the slope. It's just rolled down to the bottom. So it started up here and it rolled down. You guys can notice there's some interesting surface texture, right, on it. You can walk right up to it and look at this surface. I'm going to zoom in on this patch for you. How many of you guys can recognize these as mud cracks? Right? All of these features. This used to be a sandy, muddy surface at the edge of a creek bed. Now, it's literally hard as rock. It's a very hard sandstone. So you can tell this was the surface at the edge of an ancient river 38 million years ago. No, 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 no. What I'm interested in is this thing right here. Oh my gosh, it's so cool. Because that is a rhinoceros footprint, ladies and gentlemen. Rhinos, they have one big middle toe and two smaller side toes and a pad. One big middle toe, two smaller side toes, and a pad. This is a footprint of a mynodon. So, that thing. And I absolutely love it that you can be hiking in a canyon in West Texas in the desert today, pass by a boulder and say, hey, check out the rhino footprint, and keep going. It's pretty cool. I love this kind of stuff. Now, I said that I would address the question of why I, as a biological anthropologist, am interested in these West Texas fossils. It's because in most tropical forests today, you find primates. Primates are our order of mammals. In addition to humans, it includes things like monkeys and lorises and lemurs and tarsiers, more on them in a second, monkeys and apes and things like that. These Eocene tropical forests in the Big Bend were like most tropical forests today in having fossil ancient primates. And that is what I study. And that's what gets me out of my tent in the morning when I'm looking for fossils out there. So let me show you some of the fossils that Jack Wilson found during his work in the Big Bend. So this is the underside of a skull and the anterior view, so the front of a skull of something called Margarita Stevens' eye. And I know you guys are thinking, oh, that's what hot, thirsty paleontologists are dreaming of, margaritas. It's named after Margaret Stevens, who found the first specimen. But here are the upper teeth, the palate, the cheekbone, the underside of the brain case, and the anterior view. Here's the busted up top of the brain case, the eye socket, or the orbit, and on one side, here's the nose hole, the nasal aperture. Here's the lower jaw. It's about 38 million years old, and it is only known to this day from 4 specimens, 3 skulls and that lower jaw. And it is absolutely unique to the Devil's Graveyard of West Texas. Margarita has never been found anywhere else in the world. And here's an even more amazing fossil that Jack Wilson found. It's called Runia viejaensis. And here is a side view of Runia, an inferior view with the teeth, An anterior view, here's where the eyes would sit, the frontal, look at the nose. And it's hard for me to convey how excited I am about this fossil. Let me just see if I can give you a little taste. Most fossil primates, if you find something that looks like this, you're like, that's the greatest fossil I've ever found and probably will ever find. It's almost all there. It's incredible. Look at Runia. Oh my gosh. Do you see these little lines up here? Those are impressions from the blood vessels that used to surround the brain. Yes, look at this. These are not cracks. These are sutures or immobile joints between the bones of the snout. You can see the maxilla and the premaxilla and the lacrimal and the front. I mean, it's absolutely exquisite. In fact, we've CT scanned this at very high resolution using the industrial strength CT scanner in the basement of the Jackson School of Geosciences next door. And you can even see the delicate scrolls of bone preserved inside the nose. So my student Ingrid, who's probably in the back somewhere right now, is actually describing these. Well, maybe not exactly as we speak, but pretty much. So anyway, this is about the same age as Margarita. There is only this one single known specimen that was found in the 60s. Nobody has found another specimen of Runia since then, and it is only known from the Sierra Vieja. So, let me just say, 5 great specimens, I'll take it. I love it. But if you come to a paleontologist and you say, hey, you know, there are these 5 amazing specimens of primates from West Texas. They're only known from Texas, and they're kind of oddballs. We don't really know how they fit into other primates in terms of their evolutionary relationships. Do you know what a paleontologist will tell you every single time? They'll say, well, maybe we should go find some more. Right? It's great. You've always got the answer in paleontology. Don't know enough? Let's go find some more specimens. Which leads me to me. And yeah, this is me back when I had more hair, working at a site in the western desert of Egypt called the Fayum. So I started at UT in 2003, and one of the things that I was most excited about coming to the University of Texas was I thought, oh, I'm going to go out to the Big Bend, I'm going to revisit Jack Wilson's old field sites, I'm going to find some more of these cool fossil primates. It's going to be great. So I found out which ranch he had collected some of his most important specimens on, and I wrote out a letter on letterhead, and this is how I type. I was like, dear sir, allow me to introduce myself. I really hope that you will consider, allowing me to come collect fossils on your property just as Jack Wilson did in the 1960s and 70s. And anyway, I explained it's so important for understanding the natural history of Texas. And I mailed off my letter with great expectation. A couple of weeks later, I got a letter back, and you know what it said? It said, no. And I was like, what? I mean, it was literally like 2 lines long. No, I don't want you collecting fossils on my property. And I was like, no. Oh, this is terrible. What did I do? Should I have called them up? Should I have gone and tried to meet this person face to face? Oh, they didn't like the letter. Maybe they were an Aggie. I don't know. What was it? And so I was completely dejected. And this is where the luck part comes in. I promised you guys that I would return to this idea of luck being important for paleontology. You guys thought I meant getting lucky in terms of finding stuff in the field. This is a different kind of luck. I was having lunch on the drag a couple of weeks later with my friend Tom Younger in integrative biology. And he said, or at Madam Mams, and he said, hey, how's it going? And I was like, oh, I'm so bummed out. I got denied permission to collect fossils at this really important site out in West Texas. I don't know what to do, because if the landowners don't want you there, you're sunk. And he said, oh, that's too bad. You know, I know some people who have land in West Texas. And I just gave him that look, right? And he's not from Texas. I'm a native Texan. I know how big West Texas is, right? He was saying, yeah, there are some people with some property somewhere out here. Ladies and gentlemen, for reference, here are the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, completely swallowed up by West Texas. And I thought, is this even worth my time? And I said, yeah, give me their number. And so I called the person who knew the person, and within a couple of months, I was here. I was standing at the edge of the Devil's Graveyard at Midwestern State University's Dahlquist Desert Research Site. This was land donated to Midwestern State University by Walter and Rose Dahlquist specifically for the furtherance of scientific research in the Big Bend. So when I called them up, they said, yeah, we're looking for scientists. How soon can you come out? And I was like, wow, that's different. And then get this. You're looking out at these badlands of the Devil's Graveyard. It turns out that I had my coordinates wrong, because all of Jack Wilson's most important fossil sites were not from the ranch next door. They are from this area right here. So just by chance, in a conversation with a colleague at a Thai restaurant, I ended up exactly where I wanted to go. Wow. Let's hear it for synchronicity. Yes. Yes. Hooray for synchronicity. So since I realize that most of you have not collected fossils before, let me show you what this field work is like. The first thing you have to do is you have to convince a group of better instincts that they want to spend time with you out in the desert, not taking a shower, and looking at the ground for hours and hours on end. That's step one. Step two is you hike to the fossiliferous exposures. This is one of my favorite things to do. I mean, I do this anyway, even when there aren't fossils to be found. That's great. But once you get to the area with likely exposures, you spread out and you prospect. And you're walking along, looking at the ground, trying to spot little bits of bone and teeth eroding out of the ground. And when you do find a good spot, you crawl. And sometimes when we're in Big Bend National Park, we'll be crawling on knees and elbows across the outcrop. You're this far from the ground. And I'll occasionally see tourists pull over and they're watching us with binoculars from a distance. They're like, is this performance art? What's going on with these? Have they all gone crazy? There are like 15 people out there just crawling across the ground in slow motion. This is one of our grad students in biological anthropology, Lina Valencia Rodriguez, who she's a primatologist. She works in South America on living monkeys, but we discovered that she is absolutely fantastic at finding fossils. And when she was crawling along, you can see she's already got a lot of bone in her bag. I said, hey, Lina, move aside. Let me take a picture of the ground. This is what she's looking at. And I know that it just looks like dirt and rocks to you guys, but if you know what you're looking for, this is actually chock-a-block full of fossils. So this is the sort of thing you want to see that tells you, hey, drop down to hands and knees and start collecting everything you can see. We got some gar scales, we've got bone fragments, we've even got the tooth plates of freshwater rays. Oh, so cool. So then you employ what I like to call the plague of locusts technique. This is where you swarm across the outcrop in as systematic a way as possible, and you pick up every last little bit of bone or teeth. There's a picture being taken here about every 6 seconds, and this is what it looks like. So here it is, the glamorous life of a paleontologist crawling around in the desert on your tuchus. Now this is it. And I look at this and I'm like, oh, I wonder who's finding a primate. How exciting. So if you are really lucky, when you're out doing this, prospecting and crawling, you will find things like this. This is the lower jaw of something like a tapir, a rhinoceros relative. There's a tooth. This is a nodule with the palate of a rodent in it. These are fantastic fossils. They got multiple teeth. But if you're really lucky, oh man, you find something like this. What you see here in the fingertips of Christer Smith, who's now at the Senckenberg Museum in Germany, he's just popped open a nodule. Here's a lower jaw with 1, 2, 3 teeth of a fossil primate. This is where I should probably admit to you guys that I know that I have a problem. I know that most normal people don't get as excited as I do about tiny jaws and teeth. Jay Banner right now is probably going, oh my God, he's giving a talk about tiny jaws and teeth. This is the worst idea ever to invite him back. Let me just say, this is amazing. I mean, this is the stuff of the mammalian fossil record. 99% of identifiable mammalian fossils are teeth and jaws. You do all sorts of cool things with teeth. You can reconstruct body size. You can reconstruct evolutionary relationships. You can reconstruct diet. You do so many great things with teeth. So, let me show you what we've been finding in the world of primates of the Big Bend. In 2005, in my first trip to the Devil's Graveyard, we found this lower third molar. And I was like, oh, wait a second. This is something like Margarita. What's going on? Then we started finding more specimens as we went back out. Here's the lower jaw with 2 premolars and a molar, 3 teeth in it. What can I tell you about it? I can tell you that it's about 3 or 4 million years older than Margarita. It's lower down in the fossiliferous sequence. It's about half the size of Margarita. And you can also look at its dental anatomy and reconstruct that it had a diet of fruit and insects. That's typical for a small primate, fruits and bugs. And this, as it turns out, what I wanted to do was I wanted to find more Margarita. Instead, what I found is Margarita's great-great-grandmother. And because Margarita is only known from the Devil's Graveyard, this thing is only known from the Devil's Graveyard. So my colleague Blythe Williams and I from Duke University in 2011 described a new species. We called it Mescalerolemur horneri. Here is its upper jaw in two pieces. You're looking at the upper teeth and the cheekbone. Here's a lower jaw. So that's pretty cool. Now remember I told you there's a lot of stuff that you can do with jaws and teeth. One thing you can do is recognize evolutionary relationships. And so what I want to convince you with these slides is you don't have to be a trained paleontologist to see that the teeth of Mescalerolemur are very similar to the teeth of Margarita. So for example, this is called the third premolar, and this little nubby thing is the second premolar. Notice that the third premolar is triangular. Look at this. Here's Margarita, 4 million years later. A triangular third premolar and a little nubby second premolar. That dental anatomy, so far as is known, is unique to these two species among all fossil primates from the Eocene. So when you see something that distinctive, you're like, wow, these guys are related. In fact, what we're probably doing is sampling the same evolving evolutionary lineage at 2 points in time. Here 42 million years ago, and here it is after 4 million years of further evolution in place. Now, I realize this is a very texty slide. Bear with me. This is an analysis of the evolutionary relationships of Mescalerolemur, Margarita, a bunch of other Eocene fossil primates, and a bunch of living primates. And the way you read these diagrams is not rocket science. Every species gets a branch, and these branches coalesce at these areas called nodes. Everywhere you see one branch splitting into two, that's a common ancestor at some point in the past. And so what you're looking at is a diagram of the evolutionary relationships of all of these primates. And here are Margarita and Mescalerolemur, close relatives, down at the bottom. What's really interesting is that all of the most closely related fossil species that we can find to Mescalerolemur and Margarita, I realize that my grammar was not great there. Sorry, don't listen to me, school kids. At least not the grammar. What we can say is that these guys are most closely related, in West Texas, they're more closely related to fossil primates from Eurasia and Africa than they are to other fossil primates from North America. And when you see that pattern, it only means one thing. It means that these two endemic species of primates that are only known from West Texas migrated in from Asia, sometime in the Eocene, set up shop in West Texas and who knows where else, right? They came across from Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge. Lots of other mammals did this during the Eocene. And somehow they get isolated in West Texas and evolve in their own independent trajectory. That's pretty cool. Even cooler than that might be all of these tiny little names. These are species of living primates that are close relatives of Mescalerolemur and Margarita, and that includes lemurs, lorises, and bush babies. These are living primates that we call strepsirrhines. So if you want to imagine an ecological analog for these West Texas primates, Mescalerolemur and Margarita, look no further than the lemurs of Madagascar. Look for things like this Verreaux's shafaka or this ringtail lemur. So now what I want you to do is I want you to add, right, you're imagining forests in West Texas and the Eocene, I hope. I want you to put some lemurs up in the trees. Now they're not lemurs because lemurs are only found in Madagascar, but they're close relatives of lemurs, and they acted a lot like modern lemurs. Some more tiny teeth. Yes, I know, bear with me. Here's an upper jaw and a lower jaw of something that Blythe Williams and I named in 2008. We called it Diablomomys dalquesti. It's about the same size as Mescalerolemur. It also ate fruit and insects. It's also only known from the Devil's Graveyard. So much to my chagrin, I keep finding these primates that aren't known from anywhere else. It's this unique fauna, this unique group of primate species that you just don't see anywhere else in North America or indeed around the world. In fact, here are two bigger lower jaws with a body mass getting up close to 2 pounds of larger close relatives of Diablomomys. What we're looking at are larger species that ate more fruit. These are currently in preparation for publication, so I can't tell you what genus name I'm going to give them. But what I can tell you is who these guys are most closely related to. And all of these fossil primates, the ones I've shown you since Mescalero, lemur, and margarita, are close relatives, probably, of living tarsiers. And this crazy-looking guy right here is a tarsier. Who's heard of a tarsier before? Many of you. I'm excited to see that. For those of you who are wondering what exactly is a tarsier, allow me to show you. This is a tarsier. It does look like an owl. You know, its ecology is a lot like an owl. It's got the biggest eyeballs for its body size of any living animal. Like owls, they're predatory, and they hunt at night. They leap around from branch to branch. This is the life of a tarsier, creeping around forests of Southeast Asia, clinging to branches about 2 yards off the ground, scanning for things to eat. Here's some gratuitous slow motion for you. Leaping down, and this time it's got a lizard. Like many other primates, tarsiers are social. They live in male-female pairs, and they reinforce their bonds by singing a sweet song to each other. So here's one singing the song. You'll see the partner showing up in the distance there. It's like, what, you called? I'm here, darling. So, and they fit in the palm of your hand. So now, here's the kicker, right? If you had lemurs up in the trees in your mental image of West Texas, now I want you to add some big, fat, fruit-eating tarsiers down in the underbrush at night, creeping around. Very cool. Now, admittedly, most of what we find is not primate. The primates are rare as hen's teeth out there. We find a lot of larger mammals. I have to show you, I would be remiss if I didn't show you one of the coolest non-primates that we found so far. This is something that Michelle Stocker at Virginia Tech and I recently described, and we called it Sola Stella, which means lone star. It is also only known from Texas, and you're looking at the skull of an animal from a very, very cool group of lizards called amphisbaenians. So this is the snout. This is the lower jaw, the teeth, the brain case. That's where the eyeball would sit, the sad, teeny little eye. If you're wondering exactly what an amphisbaenian is, I like to tell people that these are the coolest animals you've never heard of. They're more commonly known as worm lizards or mole lizards. So here's the Mexican mole lizard that is only known from Baja California. So it's pink because it's burrowing. And look at the tail. It's blunt. Oh, it's like a big earthworm when you first see it, except for those tiny little front limbs. And here it is. It's about to start burrowing head first. They have these cool shovel-shaped snouts so that they can burrow head first into the ground. So we've got amphisbaenians, worm lizards burrowing around in these forest soils. And then just to tell you another story of good luck in the field, this was March of last year. And I was hiking through this field of boulders with my crew, and we were on our way somewhere else. And I said, hey, listen, as you're hiking, be sure and keep your eyes peeled for fossils. We've never really looked at these rocks, and you can find fossils in the sandstones. These are sandstone boulders. And I said, so you want to look for something like, and I looked around for the nearest scrap of bone sticking out of a sandstone boulder. I said, something like this. And I went, wait a minute. And I leaned in close, and the undergrads who were with me tell me that I cannot repeat what I said to you next. Because as I looked into this tiny, tiny fossil on a boulder, what I saw was this. Here it is, coming out of the boulder. Here's the close-up for you. This is the top of a primate skull. And so what we have here are the two eye sockets. This is where the nose starts. This is the beginning of the brain case. And it's tantalizing, right? It's just the tip of the iceberg. And I was like, oh, the rest of the skull is in there. I was high-fiving Sarah Wilson, who's here in the audience. I was like, high five, I found something as cool as your grandpa. And our somewhat taciturn preparator, who's from Germany, said, well, I'm not so sure. And I said, what do you mean? Look at the skull. And he said, sometimes they fall apart in the sandstones. And I was like, oh, don't be so negative. We're going to get this back to the lab. We're going to prep it out. It's going to be the best fossil anybody's ever found. I could probably just retire now because I'll never find anything that cool again. Well, it was good luck to find it. But as they say, the paleo gods giveth and the paleo gods taketh away. I'll tell you what, I'll take this, even though it is just the front of a skull. Sebastian was right. Everything else is missing. What you see is the forehead, the front of the brain case. These are the eye sockets, the orbits. And I know it's a primate based on its anatomy. Oh, but I don't have any teeth. And I won't know what species this is until I find some teeth from the same sorts of areas. I can tell you what kind of animal it is, though. Are you guys ready for this? How many known specimens of Runia? Do you remember? 1. Turns out that this thing shares a bunch of really cool similarities with Runia that are unique to the two. So now we have 2 specimens. 1 Runia, 1, let's call it not Runia, but related to Runia. So what we have here is a very similar primate, just to show you the sorts of features that we look at. So you won't think that I'm making this up. Here's a 3/4 view of this new frontal from the Devil's Graveyard. And this is the top of the cheekbone. And this is a little flange of bone that sticks down behind the eyeball, probably to protect it from the chewing muscle that sits right behind the eyeball. And it's got a hole in it, a foramen. This is Runia. Something that people have known about Runia for a long time is it has this weird flange of bone behind the eyeball with a hole in it. And it was like, hey, what do you know? Not Runia has that too. Another cool thing that you can do with micro-CT scanning, these are just like medical CT scanners, but they're much more powerful, much higher resolution. If you tried to CT scan a person with these, you'd cook them. You wouldn't want to do that. But bones and teeth and fossils, great. So what we've done is we CT scanned that frontal, and Ingrid, my grad student, has pulled out a virtual impression of the space where the front of the brain sat, the brain case. So these are the olfactory bulbs, and these are the frontal lobes of the brain case. This is Runia's entire virtual, it's called an endocast. It's basically the space inside the brain case where the brain sat. And what we can see here is that these big eye sockets would have been tucked underneath the frontal lobes of the brain. That is also unusual for primates from this time period. So it's a good bet that I've got something like Runia, but I can't tell you what it is because I only have a frontal bone. So stay tuned is what I say, because what's the answer anytime you have a mystery in paleontology? Go look for more, exactly. Find more fossils. I think I'll do that. What a great suggestion. Now let me say this. Let me wrap up, don't worry, for those of you who are starting to squirm. Here's the big picture from the Big Bend. What I've been describing to you, or what I sometimes like to call the original native Texans, right? We are primates. These are the first native primates to the state of Texas. Things like Runia and Margarita and Mescalera lemur and Diablomomes and not Runia. Don't worry, I'll come up with a better name than that at some point. These are fossil primates that are unique to our state, and they are not seen anywhere else in the world. And so the more fossils we get of these things, the more we come to understand this unique community of animals that inhabited the Eocene rainforests of West Texas. And to get to the question before you guys ask it in the question and answer session, if you're wondering why, when you're hiking around the Big Bend region of Texas today, you don't see non-human primates, it's climate change. Climate change. Well, you guys have heard of that, right? Because if the Eocene is really warm, how many of you guys noticed what happens at the end of the Eocene? The Eocene is much warmer than the present day, but it ends with the single biggest, most precipitous drop in global temperature of the last 66 million years. And when that happens, and it happens geologically almost overnight, when that happens, you go from forests, tropical forests over most of North America that look like, I mean, you wouldn't have this many animals, right? This is just to illustrate the animals, but nice tropical forests, jungly, a whole diverse community of organisms that depend on those forests, right? With things like lemurs and tarsiers creeping around. You go from forests like this to no forests, to woodlands and open grasslands. And when you lose the tropical forests at the end of the Eocene, you lose the primates that depend on those tropical forests. And you see a complete shift in the community of animals that you find on the landscape. So the tropical forests and the primates that depend on them are basically gone at the end of the Eocene. And that is where the story ends. Let me say, I do collaborative research. I couldn't find any of this stuff without the help of my field crews, without the help of the people at the Jackson Museum of Earth History Vertebrate Paleontology Lab. I couldn't do anything without the goodwill of the people at Midwestern State University who let me collect on their property. And I want to acknowledge one person in particular who's here in the audience tonight. This is Sarah Wilson. I mentioned her earlier. Sarah is Jack Wilson's granddaughter. And Sarah comes out and collects fossils with me from time to time. She's a professional photographer, so I want you guys to know that most of the best pictures that you just saw were taken by Sarah, who turns out, by the way, to be one of the most naturally gifted fossil collectors I've ever met. The first time I put her on the outcrop, I was like, oh, she's going to be bringing me rocks for the next 3 days before she trains her eyes. But apparently, professional photographers have got really good eyes or something like that. So within about 5 minutes, she was like, hey, what is this jar? Are those 3 little teeth in it? And I was like, whoa, you're already in business. You know what you're doing. So thank you very much. The time lapse was hers. And thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it. I should mention something else before we go to Q&A. Sarah's skipping the premiere of her movie, The Tower, to be here tonight to hear me talk. I think she made a bad choice, probably. But I just have to plug it, The Tower. And she's also got a great spread about her grandpa, Jack Wilson, in the current Texas Monthly. Check it out.
Let's hear it for Chris. Let's hear it for Sarah. Dr. Kirk will be happy to answer questions. There's a microphone on each aisle. Please just line up, and we'll hear your questions.
That was a fantastic talk, and my question, can you hear me, is have you or have Mexican counterparts, have you looked across the border in Mexico nearby in similar geologic formations for some of these primates?
First of all, thank you. It's a great question. You may have noticed that the Tornillo Basin itself doesn't really extend very far onto the other side of the Rio Grande. You very closely get into this very folded terrain. Geologists call it the Chihuahua Fold and Thrust Belt. Basically, a lot of mountain deformed sediments. However, there are Eocene exposures on the other side of the Rio Grande. There's a guy named Ferresquillo Villafranca who has worked there. But the real answer to your question is people have looked, but not nearly as closely as they've looked on our side of the border. In fact, some of the geological papers that I rely on, right, there's incredibly detailed information about the volcanic activity that's happening in the Big Bend, and then they'll say, oh, and that sediment package, that came from some unidentified volcanic source on the Mexican side of the border. It's like, you don't even know which volcano this came from? So there is a ton of work still to be done in northern Mexico, I believe.
Let's switch back and forth.
Okay, hi.
And I'll interrupt with questions from the internet.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I'm just curious, how do you derive the body mass of like a certain small mammal by the teeth?
That's a great idea. So what it relies on is a relationship between tooth size and body mass in living species. And so what we did to get these body mass, well, I didn't do this part, I just used the equations. But somebody went to a museum and they measured thousands and thousands of primate teeth. And these are primates that are alive today of known body mass. And then you look at the relationship between tooth size and body mass. And I kind of fudged that you actually get a range. And what I just showed you was the mean. So something like Mescalero lemur, it's really more like between 250 and 500 grams. And that's based on other living primates with similar sized teeth. How big are they, in other words? And that's how you get your answer. Make sense?
Yeah.
It's a great question. We spend a lot of time thinking about that. Hi.
So in the Eocene, since it was so warm, was this the period where you had the largest migration of mammals and things coming in? Because I know, edentates and marsupials were isolated in South America.
Yeah.
The Great American Interchange.
Right.
Then you also see a lot of things coming in 3-5 million years ago, mastodon, mammoths, things like that.
Yes.
Is Eocene a period where we actually had more migration?
Well, not the whole. It's a great question. The whole Eocene is not that period. Look at this. Here is the beginning of the Eocene. This is the warmest, it's not really a point in time, it's the warmest 100,000 year period of the last 66 million years. It was so warm at the beginning of the Eocene that if you, at midsummer's day, were in a rubber dinghy up at the North Pole, you could go for a swim because the surface waters were warmer than Barton Springs. So it's this period of about 100,000 years of incredible greenhouse warming. And what this allowed mammals to do is to migrate out of the tropics and across high-latitude land bridges connecting North America, Europe, and Asia. So you did see a huge, huge shift in where mammals lived at that time period. So this is when artiodactyls and perissodactyls, today's hoofed mammals, and primates first appear in North America because they're migrating in from Asia. And this is really the story of North American mammalian evolution over the last 66 million years. Some species migrating in from Asia, others, like advanced horses, migrating back across to Asia and spreading across Eurasia. Now, to get to your very good question, was this the biggest change in mammals? It was big, but I don't know if it can compete with the great American biotic interchange that you talked about. This is when the Isthmus of Panama finally forms between North and South America about 2 million years ago. And before that, South America is an island continent with its own unique organisms, like Australia today. So all of these kinds of mammals that are not around today, because as soon as the Isthmus of Panama formed, a whole bunch of North American mammals migrated in, basically drove those other mammals extinct. There are a few exceptions. The opossum that was rooting around in your garbage last night is one of the few South American forms that migrated north successfully. The armadillo that you ran over on the way here, that's one of the few South American mammals that migrated north successfully. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Excellent. Hi.
Out of all the fossils you found, which is your favorite?
Oh, which is my favorite? Oh, that's hard. That's hard. So I probably shouldn't tell you guys this. I found a primate jaw the last time I was in the field, and as soon as I saw it, I got so excited, I went, "Ow!" and I howled like a wolf, and everyone was like, "He's lost it, finally." I gotta say, that runia, that frontal bone, is probably my favorite right now because its anatomy is so unusual, and because I'm so excited about the possibility of going back to look for more.
So, Chris,
Yes.
let's interrupt with a question from the internet. It says, why don't you have any passion for your work? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry,
I'll work on it.
I couldn't resist. The question comes from Hannah and Olivia. They're with the Trinity Episcopal School, and they ask,
Hello, Anna and Olivia.
on average, how long will a paleontologist spend looking in a certain area before leaving if there had been previous success in the area?
That is such a good question. It depends on the size of the outcrop, right? So if I've gone and revisited some fossil localities where I've been thinking, wow, this is amazing, there's this great fossil sample. And you show up and you realize, oh, they all came out of this area that's about 3 square yards. And I can still see the hole from where they dug out everything. There's nothing left here. Sometimes you'll get into an area and you'll think, well, there's probably not that much here, and you go looking around, and you realize there's tons of material, because something that's really common is for paleontologists to either be focused on the big stuff or the small stuff. Guess what I'm focused on? So people tease me for standing on top of big bones while I'm like, look at this tiny rodent jaw, this is the best. And they're like, you're standing on a rhino, you didn't even see it. So sometimes somebody's been in an area and they've only seen the big stuff and they found a few things. Then you get in, you start crawling, and you're like, look at these amazing fossils. So, man, it's a great question, but it's so variable. Anything from 5 minutes to years.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Let's continue over there.
Yes, hi. Okay, so I find bones pretty regularly, but most of the bones that I find are fragments, little bits and things like that. So what you really want are what we call diagnostic bones. These are the parts of bones that you can identify either to the order that they belong to, is this a carnivore, is this a primate, or better yet, maybe even a tooth or some really diagnostic bone where you can get it down to the species. That's a lot less common. And some fossil sites are really, really good to you, and you crawl and you find, 10 different species of rodents in an hour. Sometimes you're out for a week and you find 2 or 3 scrappy jaws and you're not even really sure what they are. So again, highly variable depending on where you are. Part 2?
The second question that I have is, if wouldn't if there was a flood in the Rio Grande and an animal was near, wouldn't like another runa be picked up, the bones be picked up and thrown somewhere into the ocean?
This is a really good point. This is what paleontologists deal with a lot of the time in fast eroding badlands. If you don't get to the outcrop regularly enough, you just assume that anything that's washed out over the last 2 big rainstorms is going to end up fragmented in the bottom of the arroyo. So this is why we go out and we hit some of the same really productive outcrops with our plague of locusts technique every year. Because we know new things are going to wash out with the seasonal rains, and we want to get there before they're gone. Good question. Yeah, sure. Hi.
What does an eagle's skull look like?
Oh, eagle skulls are so cool. They've got great big eye sockets. They have, instead of our cheekbones, they have these little splints of bone that come down to their upper beak. Of course, their upper beak is big and recurved. But can I tell you maybe the coolest thing about a really well-prepared eagle skull is that you see eagles, unlike us, have a ring of bones in their eyeball. And so if you have a really well-preserved eagle skull, in its eye socket will be a big round ring of bones that looks like a bony eye. Pretty cool.
Good question.
Hey.
So I was wondering if, I learned that if an animal is young and they die, their skull will have like a crack through the middle. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. Yeah. In fact, how did you learn about that? That's great. That's what, if I can get back to this picture here, check this out. Do you see this little line? That little line right there is where the left and the right halves of this bone, this is basically the forehead of this primate, hasn't grown together yet. And who knows if it would have grown together as an adult. But the reason we just have this one piece of this skull is because it was obviously young, and the joints between the bones of the skull hadn't really fused together well. And so when this washed into the stream, where this frontal bone is going to get deposited in a sandbank next to the stream, it just fell apart. If this had been a couple of years older, we might have had the full thing. Good? Excellent. Thank you. Hi.
First off, I loved your presentation. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much.
My question is, how long does it take to find a bone and then identify it?
Oh, boy.
From start to finish?
I love all these great questions that I'm getting. It depends on the state of preservation, and it depends on the bone. Some bones are really, really diagnostic. They're really easy to spot. Oh, it has characteristic features that belong to this group. So for example, when this frontal bone was still in this boulder, I looked at it and I said, that is a primate. And the reason I could tell is because the orbits, the eye sockets, are forward facing. And most mammals have eye sockets that face sideways. And there were even a few people who were with me, they were like, you can't tell that's a primate. I was like, that's a primate. Now, a lot of the time, though, you'll find the end of a long bone, and you'll be able to say, oh, that's the end of a femur or a humerus or something like that. But you won't know exactly what kind of animal it is. Now, in terms of how long it takes to make that determination, do you remember I showed you a picture? Well, this fossil is still inside the rock that it was originally fossilized in, right? So what we had to do before we could really figure out what this looked like is this guy Sebastian that I mentioned. We hammered out about a 40-pound piece of this boulder, and he slung it on his back, and he hiked 3 miles back to camp with this 40-pound rock on his back. And he spent about 3 weeks under a microscope picking off every individual grain of sand. And so we couldn't say much about it with any certainty until we'd taken the weeks to take it out of, this is called the matrix that it sits in. And a lot of the fossils that I find are in nodules, and I can see there's a tooth in there, but it might be a year before I finally get the chance to prep it out of that nodule and see exactly what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, here's
Yes.
another question from the internet, also from a Trinity Episcopal school. Question is, what nutritional value do hyenas gain from eating the horns, antlers, and bones of an animal?
You know, that's a really good point. So thank you for the question. camera. There you are. Hello, welcome on the web. What do they get? Well, bones are calcium phosphate, and everybody needs calcium in their diet and phosphorus in their diet. But they're also protein. There's a lot of collagen in bone. And so it's actually a good source of protein for hyenas. They also get the marrow, both the fatty marrow and the red marrow, which is full of nutrients inside the bones. And in terms of hooves and horns have got a keratinous shell, or not a shell, a layer of keratin. Keratin's the stuff that your fingernails are made out of. And I'm pretty sure somebody who knows biochemistry tell me that's a protein too, right? Yeah, okay. So it's basically another protein source. So lots of good things if you can handle processing the material with your mouth and your gut.
Thanks. Let's continue.
Hi.
So if you have the skull, how come you can only tell like the species by the teeth? You didn't have the teeth, but you couldn't tell what the species was even though you had the skull.
I know. So did you notice that before, that's another fantastic question. Did you notice that I was naming all of these new species based on their teeth? So because 99% of the time what you have is jaws and teeth that allow you to see, hey, this is a different species from anything I've seen before, we basically become reliant, if we study mammal evolution, for any group of mammals, on studying the teeth. So when you do find something like this that doesn't have teeth associated with it, you're in trouble, you're sunk. Because all of the characteristics that are used to recognize the new species in the first place are based on dental anatomy. So it's like, oh, that's why I have to go find some teeth now. Great question. Hi.
Hi. How do you know when the forest animals became extinct? Like you said, the temperatures dropped, but how do you know that affected them?
Well, there are another good question. So we know that they are gone, not just because you find, if you look at fossil leaves and things like that, you can see that the community of plants has changed. But there are some places, in North America included, where you have continuous fossil-bearing sedimentary sequences that start in the late Eocene, and they go all the way into the next epoch after that, the Oligocene. And you can actually watch the new open country adapted animals. Like there's this big group of fast-running rhinos called Hyracidon that move into the scene, and they're like, hey, look at us. There aren't any trees to get in our way, so we can run fast across the grasslands. You can actually see in the record as one group is replaced by another, and you see this major pulse of turnover in animal communities in the record right there at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. Did that answer your question? You basically see the fossils change.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hello?
All right. Are you teaching any courses next semester for non-majors?
I am on my first sabbatical next semester in a long time, but I will be teaching a full schedule in the next academic year. Okay. So I will be starting with Introduction to Biological Anthropology. If you're curious and you want to geek out with me and learn all of this stuff in even more excruciating detail, please join me.
Thank you.
Sure. Hi.
Okay, so earlier in your presentation you mentioned being able to tell the climate of an area during a period of time by using isotopes in the bottom of the ocean.
Yes.
And I was hoping you could elaborate on that.
Yes, absolutely. So in other words, where does this curve come from? The first thing you have to have is you have to have the deep sea sediment cores. And I don't know if you guys know this, but since the mid-1960s, there's been a major international collaborative effort for drilling rigs to go all over the oceans and dig down into the muck at the bottom of the sea. So, and you get these drill cores. So every single individual data point is measured from a different point in the ocean and a different core. And what you're looking at specifically are the tiny fossil shells of marine plankton, things like foraminifera and coccoliths, if you've heard of them before. So like marine protists, like little amoebas with calcareous shells, little golden algae with calcareous shells. These things live in the ocean, and there are trillions upon trillions of them. And as they die, there's this constant rain of calcium carbonate shells down from the topwaters into the deep ocean oozes. And what they do is, as they build their calcium carbonate shells, they incorporate different stable isotopes of oxygen. You guys remember what isotopes are? They're the same atom, different numbers of neutrons. So they're chemically almost identical, but they're heavier or lighter. And so a number of factors lead these organisms to incorporate different stable isotopes of oxygen into their shells at different ratios according to the temperature. So if you have this very predictable relationship between oxygen isotopes that are incorporated into shells as these organisms grow, and you know what that relationship is, and then you have access to what those shells were like over time in terms of their oxygen isotope ratios, I tell my students it's the closest thing to having a time machine and a thermometer. Right? It's this one-to-one relationship between isotope temperature. Bada boom, bada bing, I give you the record of ancient temperatures on our planet.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Hi.
Great question.
Oh.
And let me just add that we have a Sarah Wilson photo here that Chris is going to sign, and he's going to give it out to who he has deemed has asked the best questions.
Oh, that's tough.
So, no pressure, sorry.
Make it good. Just kidding.
So, I have a couple questions.
Okay.
So, what primates are humans closest related to?
Oh, that is a great question. It turns out that we are equally closely related to two kinds of living primates, the common chimpanzee and the pygmy chimpanzee or bonobo. Those two species, which are only found in tropical Africa today, share a common ancestor about 3 or 4 million years ago. But our own evolutionary lineage shares a common ancestor with chimps and bonobos about 7 or 8 million years ago. So we don't just have one closest living relative, we've actually got two. Yeah.
Also, me and my class went this trip for like a riverbed. We found this bone, and we didn't know where it came from. It was just this random bone.
Oh, cool.
So do you have any hints on where it might have come from?
Oh, man. You know, so it would depend on what river you're. I mean, so my son David and I last weekend were in Shoal Creek, and he found the tooth of a bison, a Pleistocene bison. And I knew that because I knew, the approximate age of the sediments around where we were looking. And so if I knew where you were, I might be able to tell you. But without that information, without seeing the bone, it's so hard for me to tell because it could be as old as the Cretaceous, right? It could be like the bone of a mosasaur. It could be as recent as yesterday. You know, we find a lot of beef ribs in the creek whenever we're looking around. So, but if you're curious, the Texas Memorial Museum does a fossil identification day. You can bring them in, and the experts there will tell you. You can also feel free, this is true for anybody. One of my favorite games is the What is This Bone game. Anybody who wants to send me a picture of a fossil that you found, I'm happy to take a look at it.
And I also wanted to say, horses did not walk on their toes. They walk on their toenails.
You know what? She's absolutely right. Did you guys hear that? They walk on their toenails, not their toes. Thank you for the correction. Excellent.
We have a contender for.
Yeah, I think so. Let me just give her one right.
So we're running short on time. So
okay.
So these will be everyone who's standing in line. These will be the last questions. Okay.
All right. Hi.
I was just wondering if you found fossils anywhere else besides West Texas.
Yeah, I love one of the coolest things, also from the Eocene, that's even closer to Austin, is there are various places out around Bastrop where you can find absolutely gorgeous leaf fossils. And these are the leaves from these tropical forest plants. They've often got smooth sides, and then in a lot of rainforests, the leaves have it looks like a little turkey snood at the end. It's called a drip tip. And it's a way of channeling water off of a leaf when there's high rainfall. A lot of these leaves that you find from around Bastrop, from the Eocene, these would have been the forests closer to the coast at that time. They've got drip tips. You find a lot of palms. So that's, of all the places I find fossils in Texas, that might be my second favorite. Yeah. Hello again.
Hello. I was just going to ask if do you ever get so excited that you found a bone that you accidentally break it?
I might have a few stories like that. I was collecting 2 summers ago with a former anthropology undergrad from UT. Her name is Rachel Dunn, and she's now a professor of anatomy at a medical school. And she was opening up her first field site in a place called the Sandwash Basin of northwestern Colorado, also Eocene. And one of the field crew members found a tooth, had it wrapped up in toilet paper, and I was like, let me see, let me see, let me see. I really want to see, oh, it looks so cool. And they were like, well, I don't know if that's a good idea. It's kind of windy. And I was like, come on, come on, come on, open it up. I want to see the tooth. I want to see the tooth. And they opened up the tooth and handed it to me in a big gust of wind. Whoosh. Took it away, and I was like, I am so sorry. I lost your tooth. If I had just waited until the wind had died down or we were back in the lab, we would still have that tooth. Mea culpa. Hi.
Hi. I just want to ask, like, how do you tell that animals migrate from Texas to Asian, but not from Asian to Texas?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. What's the direction of migration? And it has to do with a good understanding of the fossil record of both continents. So in the case of migrants into North America, what you typically want to see are relatives of those migrants in Asia from dates earlier than the migration event. Same thing with these horses. There's a type of three-toed horse called a hipparion that goes from North America into Asia right around 10 million years ago, and they spread out across Eurasia. And what you can see is you can see those species evolving in North America during that time period, the Miocene, in the fossil record. And then all of a sudden they appear on the other side of the Bering Strait in Asia. And you can actually follow their spread from one fossil site to the other across Asia. So the ability to answer that question has a lot to do with dense sampling of the fossil record in both places of interest.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Hello.
3 questions. Well, what was your first bone you found?
Ooh, wow. So my first fossil bone? Can I tell you what it was even though it wasn't a bone? My dad, who's sitting here in the front row, took me out collecting when I was about your age, actually. How old are you?
7.
You're 7. I was actually younger than you. And he took me collecting in a creek behind our house. And I was like, what are we doing? We're walking through this creek. And he was like, no, we're going to find some cool stuff. And we came across a great big spiral shell of something called an ammonite. It's basically like a big squid that lived in a shell, sort of like a nautilus today. And I'm not entirely sure why. This is what I loved before I loved tiny teeth. I took one look at that thing and I just fell in love with it. I just thought it was the coolest thing I had ever seen in my life. And I took it to my best friend down the street and I was like, oh my gosh, look at this thing I found. This is so amazing. It's so cool. And he was like, yeah, it's a rock. What have you got there? And I was like, no, it's an ammonite. They were like squid, and they lived in the ocean 100 million years ago. And he was like, okay. And that was my first indication that other people might not be as into fossils as I am.
What was the biggest fossil you found?
Biggest fossil I found. The biggest thing I found in my time in the Big Bend is a really nice skull of that big hippo-like rhino called a mynodon. And first, we found teeth running down a hillside that had been washed down a runnel in a hillside, and we collected the teeth going up to the top of the hill. Up at the top of the hill, there's the rest of the skull sticking up out of the ground. So it was one of those things where you're like, oh, it's super exciting that we found this. Now we're going to spend 2 days getting it out of the ground.
And, well, most of you probably already know, but another way to tell if it's a predator or prey is the eyes. If the eyes are on the front of the skull, they're predator, so they can see straight, and prey, so they can are pretty much on the sides, so they can see around better and watch out if there's a predator coming.
I want to get a high five because I think it's so cool that you know that. Thank you. He's absolutely right. Hi.
So I'm actually currently into paleontology, and we have a landslide next to our house in our green belt. We live in central Texas in the Walnut Creek area, so what kind of fossils do you think we could find around there?
Ooh, okay, so you're going to find a lot of Cretaceous fossils. And during the Cretaceous, this is the last period of the Mesozoic, or the age of dinosaurs. Not saying you can't find dinosaurs there, but most of them are going to be shallow marine. So the coolest things, I think, besides ammonites that you might find, would be things like mosasaurs, these giant marine lizards. things like plesiosaurs. My son David and I find a lot of shark's teeth. But then, in most of the creek beds around here, look for a color change in the bank. And you'll see limestones and clays and things like that from the Cretaceous. And then you usually see an uneven, wavy boundary between those lighter colored white or gray sediments and the dark sediments on top. Sometimes those darker sediments on top can be tens of thousands of years old, and you'll find things like mammoth or direwolves or other cool things like that washing out of the upper part. That's how, last weekend with my son David, I found a Cretaceous shark's tooth, and then he found a bison tooth. You know, right in the same part of the creek, because they were from different parts of the section. That's what I would bet on in the Walnut Creek area.
Okay. And don't forget about sea urchins.
Would tell about sea urchins?
No, not after. But how do you tell that it's a new species from the tooth?
Oh, okay. How do you tell that you have a new species? Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? Because in order to identify something as a completely new species of primate, you have to convince all of your colleagues who also study fossil primates that you have compared these teeth that you have with every other fossil primate that's out there, right? Hundreds or thousands of other specimens. I mean, in North America alone, there are like 50 or 60 different species of Eocene primates from different time periods. And so it is a laborious and time-consuming process to compare detail by detail, tooth part by tooth part. And what you're looking for are a series of features that make your teeth distinctive and different from all the other teeth that have been found. And that process sometimes takes years. I mean, for Mescalero lemur, I originally just had a third molar, and I thought it was originally just a new species of margarita, a small species of margarita. You guys want to know what I was going to call it? I was going to call it Margarita epipetros, Margarita on the rocks. And so I had my name picked out and everything. But then as I started over the next couple of years finding more and more teeth, I was like, oh, this is different enough that I can't put it in the same genus, Margarita. I have to come up with a new one. So I guess the short answer is a lot of time and comparison is what you need.
All right, we have the last question.
Woo!
So, you know, like Runea?
Yeah.
Do you think that it came over the land bridge as Runea, or do you think it evolved that way into Runea in North America? And if you do you have, like, any evidence?
Oh. She's a savvy questioner. I was like, how can I spin this in some way that would be a compelling story? And then she trapped me. She was like, what's your evidence? And I was like, well, I'm sunk. The one thing that I can say about Runea is that in every piece of its anatomy, we've got a whole pristine skull. We know more about its skull and upper dental anatomy than almost any other Eocene primate, right? We can look at its nose, we can look at its ear, we can do all kinds of cool stuff. And yet, it is so primitive, I can't find good features to link it to any other group of primates. And what I mean by primitive is I mean that all of its anatomy looks like what is probably the last common ancestor of all primates. Now, I'm not saying it was the last common ancestor of all primates. I'm saying that it hadn't evolved any distinctive characteristics that I can find to link it to known groups, like, oh, it's linked with a tarsier. Oh, it's linked with this group of fossil primates from Europe. Oh, it's linked with lorises or something like that. It's so primitive, it's really one of the biggest mysteries that I have. And that's why I was looking for more, right? You know, I'd dearly love to not just find the lower jaw of Runea, I'd love to find some parts of its body, right? Like an ankle bone would be great. Ankle bones are great for figuring out evolutionary relationships. But until we get more fossils, we're stumped. And one of the main reasons I CT scanned Runea is I thought, ha-ha, I'm going to peer inside its nose and its ear, and I'm going to see anatomy no one's ever seen before. And yes, I will figure out what Runea is. And instead, I looked in the nose and I looked in the ear, and I was like, primitive, primitive, primitive. There's still nothing to link it up. So I don't know. I don't even have a gut feeling for where it goes. I just know it's a primate.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
All right, if you think you've asked the best question, you can come on up. If you have another question for Chris, he'd probably be happy to hang out for a little bit afterwards. But for now, let's thank him for his passion.
Thank you all.